The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. U.S. President Donald Trump has announced that the U.S. will send top-of-the-line weapons to Ukraine via NATO countries, while also threatening Russia with severe tariffs if a deal to end the war is not reached within 50 days. On the tariffs front, Trump said that the U.S. would impose 100% secondary tariffs targeting Russia's remaining trade partners if a peace deal with Ukraine is not met by the deadline. This would see any country that trades with Russia face the tax if they want to sell their products to the U.S. This announcement marks a significant shift from Trump's earlier efforts at rapprochement with Vladimir Putin, as frustration has grown over continued Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities. How realistic is it that Russia would make a deal within the 50-day deadline? And what does this ultimatum signal about Trump's intentions and strategy towards ending the war? Well, joining us today is Markus Wagner, who's a professor of law at the University of Wollongong. Hi, Professor Wagner. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Professor, how significant is the threat of 100% secondary tariffs on Russia? I mean, can Russia absorb this blow, or is it a serious escalation?
So I think we need to distinguish between two things that the president announced, President Trump that is. Number one, there's 100% tariffs on Russian goods, and then there's secondary sanctions against countries that trade with Russia. So those are two different things. And a few years ago, the threat of tariffs against Russian imports into the US would have had some impact, potentially, but the trade with Russia is more or less negligible by now. The major export destinations, this is where these secondary sanctions are coming into play, are now China, India, and to a lesser extent, Europe. And that's where these announcements become significant because Russia exports a fair amount of oil to India and China. And the question is whether the Trump administration and the US can force, by sanctioning China and India, a change in position in Russia.
Well, then what should we make of this? I mean, does this mark a major shift in Donald Trump's approach to the war between Ukraine and Russia?
So all of these things have to be seen in exactly this context. It appears that there is a major shift. With all things Trump, I would urge a bit of caution. We don't quite know what the contours of this shift really are, and they're very hard to predict. You might remember that just a few weeks ago, I would say, the Trump administration cut Ukraine off from weapon supplies and more general military support. And this came after the very infamous Oval Office meeting between Trump and his officials on the one hand and the Ukrainian president on the other hand, that turned into a shouting match that most of your listeners will have seen. But again, as with all things Trump, whether there's any permanency to it really remains to be seen at this point.
Right. Well, along with the tariff threats here, Trump says he has sealed an agreement with NATO allies that will lead to large-scale arms deliveries to Ukraine, including Patriot missiles. So how significant is this deal with NATO then?
So at first blush, it seems significant, but I would urge a bit of caution. There are at least two things to consider. There doesn't seem to be financial commitment by the U.S. And Trump has never been particularly hawkish vis-a-vis Russia or shown any particular interest in Ukraine. And even more so, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, actively wants the U.S. to pull out of overseas commitments. What appears to have happened here is a different story a little bit. It's essentially support for U.S. defense manufacturers. So the idea seems to be that European allies of the U.S. or European countries, whether they're allies at this point is unclear, will be able to buy U.S. products, and these products can then be donated to Ukraine, or these countries may be able to replenish their own stocks, which they have passed on to Ukraine already. And so there's no financial commitment. It seems to be a boon for the U.S. defense industry almost. But if this comes to pass, at least some weapon flows that are currently no longer happening might be happening if European countries are willing to buy these weapons and pass them on to Ukraine.
Right. Well, Professor, ever since his political rise a decade ago, Donald Trump has, always sung the praises of Vladimir Putin. So why the switch up now? Has Mr. Trump's, bromance with Mr. Putin run its course?
Well, I'm glad you used the term bromance, but there does seem to be a switch up. I don't know that there is a really good, solid policy answer to it, but rather it might, again, be inexplicable through Donald Trump's psyche, if you will. He seems to be very impatient at this point with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and he simply doesn't want to do what Trump would like him to do. Mm-hmm. And we saw this roughly 2 weeks ago when Donald Trump appeared to be rather frustrated with Putin after a phone call that the two of them had. And then I think the next day, we saw a very large drone strikes against Ukrainian cities. Trump's unhappiness increased with choice words that I will not repeat here in a cabinet meeting. But it's good to remember that Putin has played this game many times over. He's had more than 25 years to do this. And it's also good to remember that the invasion of Ukraine didn't start in 2022, but rather in 2014. And the idea that Trump had always floated he could do away with this war within one day, I always thought was nonsense, frankly speaking. And his efforts were half-hearted so far. And again, we don't know how far Trump is willing to go. It's an arm's length agreement between Trump and Ukraine with interlocutors in Europe. And this arbitrary deadline of 50 days, there's nothing particularly to 50 days. It's just a number that Donald Trump appears to have thought up.
Right. Well, but Trump's move, it comes after months of talking about ending the war quickly and even seeking dialogue with Putin. Yet he's now approving high-end weapons for Ukraine and threatening tough sanctions. Is this a big win for Ukraine then?
If, and this is a big if, Donald Trump is willing to follow through, it would be. I would probably be cautious about these high-end weapons because they tend to be very expensive, and the attacks that Russia is conducting are with relatively low-tech drones. So the question is always how many of your high-cost missile do you want to sacrifice for low-cost targets? But if it comes to pass, yes. The novelty really here is really to me these secondary sanctions. And it'll be fascinating and potentially dangerous to see how they play out, but because there's a lot of things we don't know. Yeah. Does it only apply to certain countries? Does it apply to all sales of products that Russia exports? Does it apply to all goods from these countries? Is there some dependency, say a washing machine from China being sent to the US? Is there a requirement to have some kind of Russian involvement in that supply chain, even if it's just energy? That's the really tricky thing.
I mean, could these new threats of sanctions and tariffs really pressure Russia into, peace talks, or might they just push Russia to dig in further?
So it all depends on what China is doing from my perspective.
Okay.
India is not as relevant a player and has a bit more room, if you will, when it comes to dependency on Russian oil. Mm-hmm. It was a bit opportunistic, India that is, because it simply it went from a 1% dependency of Russian oil to be precise. It's now 40%. So it might have the ability to go somewhere else. But China is really the big question, and that might come down to a showdown with Beijing. Is Trump ready for this? Because Beijing or China imports a far larger portion of its oil from Russia and is dependent on that. And if you want to attempt to undermine Russia by pushing really high tariffs against China, then my own take is that China will simply do what it has done before. It'll play tit for tat. And that is damaging to the US, which is already on the verge of high inflation. The tariffs are supposed to come in a few weeks, and they will eventually bite. And Trump has always chickened away from that particular bit. The taco term comes back to mind. Trump always chickens out. We'll have to see whether it happens again.
Okay. Well, has Russia since responded to this move? Or, what are the likely Russian calculations in response?
I think all we've seen so far, this has only been happening in the last, 16, 20 hours. Mm-hmm. All we've seen so far is rhetoric coming from Kremlin-adjacent news media or politicians. My suspicion is that, and this is again prediction, is that the Kremlin will simply, and Putin will simply dig in. And it very much depends on whether China could be brought on board, but that would mean some kind of alliance between the US and China, which given how Trump has been behaving in the last half year since inauguration is very unlikely to happen.
I see. Well, then could this tactic risk escalating the war if Russia sees it as, a provocation rather than a de-escalation?
I would certainly think so, because there's just no reason for Putin to give up what he's been doing. So unless China starts putting pressure on Putin, I don't see anything changing. Russia is not winning the war in grandiose ways, but land gains are, if anything, on the Russian side. Ukraine has trouble with recruitment and maintaining its positions. And frankly, Putin does not care how many of his soldiers are getting lost in the war machine that he's built.
So does that mean it's not really realistic to expect a meaningful or enforceable peace deal within that 50-day time frame?
The 50 days are made up. Let's be realistic.
Okay.
It's a number that Donald Trump has thrown out. And if it comes to pass, I would be very happy. And I think many people would be very happy. But I just don't think that the strategy that the Trump administration has pursued over the last half year under Trump 2.0 it just doesn't lead me to think that he can pull enough countries to the US's position at this point, because it's always been adversarial. It has been adversarial with everyone virtually. And unlike Trump 1.0, where the main target was China, these sort of Liberation Day tariffs or threats were made against everyone, including the closest allies, which you would now need in order to potentially convince other countries to come on board. But that's simply not happened.
So is it right to assume that Russia would simply wait out the 50 days and calling Trump's bluff in this case?
I think that is very likely to happen. There's, I would say, in the trade space, we've seen this talk about taco, Trump always chickening out quite a bit, where Trump has changed the conversation and pushed the Overton window, and where now almost everyone seems to be happy with 10% tariffs, which would have been abhorrent a few years ago. But here the situation's different. Putin can wait things out. There is almost no direct dependency of Russia and its economy on the US. And again, unless for some reason that I can't see happening, China and other countries such as India give up on trading with Russia, there's just no incentive for Russia to come to the table.
Well, I mean, if the strategy fails, then what are the consequences for U.S. credibility, especially with, allies and adversaries watching how Trump enforces this threat?
Look, I would submit to you that the U.S. credibility is already very low.
Okay.
If you look at some surveys, global surveys, it has fallen below the credibility of China under Trump 2.0. It hasn't taken very long. Whatever credibility and goodwill, and there was quite a bit, I would submit again, has been built up over decades. That has been reversed, and it's a stunning reversal of attitudes. And didn't take very long to reverse that image. Like I said, that's been built up over decades. And this unpredictability is a real problem. You might think back about, April 20th, I think, when the bond market or the bond yields crashed, basically, and forced the Trump administration to retreat from these Liberation Day tariffs. And I think there is a very real risk that this will happen again. And let me add one more thought on this, which is that the long-term consequences for the U.S. are really dire. Because why would you want to think that any agreement, and I don't mean a technical legal agreement, but any kind of deal that you might reach with the Trump administration would be honored? And in some ways, all this does is drive some countries into the arms of China, the main geoeconomic and geopolitical rival at this point. And then there's a really tough decision that might have to be made for countries that find themselves in the middle, like Australia, where I live, or Singapore, where you are.
Professor, I mean, as you mentioned, this move to impose 100% secondary tariffs on Russia means that any country that continues to do trade with Russia will face a big tax to sell their products to the U.S. So at an economic perspective here, what impact might Trump's threat of 100% secondary sanctions have on Russia's war economy and on countries still trading with Russia like China or even India?
So I mentioned some of this already. India has a bit more slack, if you will. Its oil dependency is not nearly as high. The dependency of China is quite high. So China is essentially dependent for energy supplies for its ally or on its ally Russia. And again, unless China comes to the table somehow and tries to convince Russia that it needs to pull back, which I do not see as a realistic thing or a realistic outcome, all I can see then is a tit-for-tat trade war, which we have started to see early on with the consequences that are then predictable. The stock market will likely suffer. The bond market will likely suffer. Whether what impact that has in a second or third go around, we'll see. But uncertainty has certainly increased dramatically, and geopolitical rivalry will just increase on the back of that.
And how might this reshape global energy markets, particularly for countries reliant on Russian oil or gas?
Look, if other countries decide to give in, Russia will be worse off. It will no longer have the capacity to export oil and gas, and therefore will no longer have funds flowing into its own coffers. It's already in pretty poor shape. Interest rates are high. That's eliminated investments. Growth is forecast by some to be below 1%. So this already fairly bad shape economy is propped up by very few energy buyers. That would make the Russian situation worse. But if it does not happen, it would make the situation worse for everyone else, because this uncertainty, gray market, arbitraging, and so forth would all start to happen, and prices will very likely go up.
Well, then, could secondary sanctions on Russia's trade partners also trigger a backlash from the global south or BRICS countries?
It might. I don't think there's going to be a short-term reaction in as much as some people might predict. But it's much more in line with this general reordering that I alluded to just a little bit ago that we've seen over the last few years and has accelerated considerably under Trump. You mentioned the BRICS countries. The BRICS countries, that group has enlarged. I don't know that there's a coherent vision amongst all of these countries. I actually think there is none, except for opposing what the Trump administration seems to be doing. But the questions of a secondary, if you will, reserve currency might rise again. The geoeconomic and geopolitical situation is already undergoing change. We're seeing lots of rerouting of trade already happening. This initial shock for the Chinese economy that we've seen the first half of 2025, it's still not great, but I think there is sort of some rethinking going on who the trading partners will be. And China seems to be doing better than certainly some people in Washington would have hoped.
Right. Well, Trump has described Putin as a tough guy and shared that there were several moments when peace deals were nearly reached only to collapse after new Russian attacks. So before we let you go here, Professor, what do you think would be the most realistic steps for the U.S. to take to bring this war closer to an end without risking an even larger conflict?
I don't know that sort of bringing this particular conflict between Ukraine and Russia to an end is attainable any longer in the short term. Under normal, and here I mean non-Trump circumstances, there would have been strategic planning in the White House, and we have seen evidence that that is almost entirely absent under the Trump White House, the strategic planning there is. So ending this conflict would have meant trying to gain allies, convincing Europe of things it now has done, namely cutting off or reducing its dependency on Russian oil and gas, but also trying to convince Russia that it should try and convince China to not have as close a trading relationship with other partners. Because of all the uncertainty we've seen since January 20th, and because of all these threats against the closest allies, Mexico, Canada, European countries, Japan, Australia, Singapore, Vietnam, all of countries which have been threatened with incredibly high tariffs, never mind the penguins and herd in McDonald Islands, which happen to be Australian. But all of that has engendered bad faith in anything that comes out of the White House at this moment, which you would need the opposite, good faith, in order to gain that kind of allyship to make that happen. So unfortunately, and I'm finding myself in Europe at this particular time, I don't see a particularly good way forward for peace talks and a peace agreement, an actual lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia in the foreseeable future.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for your time and your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was Markus Wagner, who's a professor of law at the University of Wollongong. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.